At 46, former Navy SEAL Jack Miller had little left but an aging pickup, a leaking trailer, and Buddy, his 7-year-old German shepherd who never stopped watching over him. After losing his warehouse job and nearly all his savings, Jack took day labor wherever he could find it, often choosing between fuel, food, and keeping Buddy fed. Then he spent his last $3,400 on something no one else wanted. Blackwater Quarry, a flooded pit locals had avoided for decades. Months later, a brutal drought lowered the waterline, and Buddy became obsessed with one muddy stretch of shoreline. What surfaced there was not mining equipment, and what it had been hiding could rewrite the history of the entire town. Before we go further, where are you watching from? Your city, state, or country? A cold November rain swept across eastern Kentucky, turning warehouse yards silver and leaving the hills beyond town hidden beneath low gray clouds. Jack Miller had learned long ago that bad weather rarely waited for a man to be ready. At 46, Jack still carried himself like someone who had once been expected to move when everyone else froze. He was tall and lean rather than heavily built, with broad shoulders softened by years of ordinary labor, short, dark brown hair threaded with gray at the temples, and a weathered face that looked older whenever he was tired. For more than a decade of his younger life, he had served as a Navy SEAL, spending long stretches far from home in places he rarely spoke about. The war had not left him with dramatic stories he enjoyed telling. It had left him with quieter things. The habit of sitting where he could see the door, waking at small sounds, noticing exits before furniture, and feeling uncomfortable whenever life became too still. After leaving the service, Jack discovered that returning home and belonging there were not the same thing. He never expected medals to make him rich, but he had imagined steady work, perhaps a modest house, maybe enough savings that an unexpected bill would not feel like an approaching storm. Instead, the years became a collection of loading docks, delivery routes, construction crews, warehouse shifts, and paychecks that disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived. Jack did not resent the work. He respected anyone who earned his living with tired hands. What frightened him was how little distance there seemed to be between surviving and falling. For the previous 2 years, Jack had worked for Blue Ridge Building Transport, loading pallets of stone, roofing materials, cement, and lumber onto trucks headed across Kentucky. He arrived before sunrise, stayed late when another worker needed help, and rarely complained about overtime. Buddy waited for him every evening. The 7-year-old German shepherd had a strong but aging frame, a black and tan coat beginning to fade around the shoulders, and the first clear streaks of gray around his muzzle. His right ear leaned slightly outward when he was curious, giving him an unexpectedly gentle expression for such a large dog. Buddy had never been a military dog, and Jack never pretended otherwise. He had adopted him years earlier after finding him at a county shelter, already grown and repeatedly passed over because some families thought he was too large. Jack had recognized something familiar in the animal: alert eyes, restrained energy, and a strange patience with disappointment. Their relationship developed without ceremony. Buddy learned when Jack needed company, and when silence was kinder. On nights when Jack woke suddenly from dreams he could not fully remember, Buddy would lift his head from the floor and remain awake until Jack's breathing slowed. Jack sometimes joked that Buddy had become his cheapest therapist, although the dog demanded payment in chicken whenever possible. The first sign that Blue Ridge was failing came when overtime disappeared. Then several trucks were parked because repairs had been postponed. Suppliers stopped extending credit, and one Friday the workers' paychecks arrived 2 days late. Jack knew what those signs meant, but knowing did not make them easier to accept. 3 weeks later, management gathered everyone beside the loading bays and announced that the company was shutting down. Jack stood among men he had worked beside for years, listening to words like restructuring, insolvency, and unfortunate circumstances. All he heard was no more paycheck. He had less than $4,000 saved, an aging Chevrolet pickup that consumed more gasoline every month, and rent due in 9 days. Jack took temporary work almost immediately. He unloaded furniture one afternoon, cleared storm debris the next, and spent 3 nights stacking boxes in a grocery distribution warehouse. Still, temporary wages could not catch permanent bills. When his landlord finally told him he could no longer carry the unpaid rent, Jack did not argue. He packed 2 duffel bags, Buddy's food, an old sleeping bag, a few framed photographs, and the small metal box containing his military papers. Everything else either went into cheap storage or was left behind. The Chevrolet became home. Jack folded himself across the bench seat when it rained and slept beneath a tarp in the truck bed when the weather allowed. Buddy occupied whatever space remained, and somehow always managed to stretch into more of it during the night. Jack parked in different places so businesses would not complain: behind a 24-hour laundromat, near a truck stop, sometimes along a gravel road outside town. He learned which gas stations allowed him to wash his face without questions, and which parking lots had security guards who treated a man sleeping in a pickup as if poverty were a crime. There were evenings when Jack bought one hot meal and told himself he was not hungry enough to finish it, sliding pieces of meat toward Buddy instead. Buddy, annoyingly perceptive, sometimes refused to eat until Jack took another bite. One freezing morning, Jack spent nearly half his remaining cash replacing a failing alternator, because without the truck he could neither sleep safely nor reach temporary jobs. He sat behind the steering wheel afterward, staring at the receipt, and felt something inside him tighten. He had survived situations overseas in which decisions had consequences measured in seconds. Yet here he was, defeated for 10 minutes by an auto parts bill. That thought embarrassed him, then angered him, and finally made him laugh quietly. Buddy stared at him from the passenger seat, as if deciding whether humans were worth the trouble. Jack's hardship did not make him cruel. At a temporary loading job, another worker named Pete mentioned that his daughter needed antibiotics, and he was short on cash until payday. Jack handed him $40, even though he knew exactly how little remained in his own wallet. Later that week, he helped an elderly veteran jumpstart a van at a grocery store and refused the $20 bill the man tried to give him. Jack understood the contradiction. He was worried about every dollar, yet continued giving some of them away. But there was a line he would not cross simply because life had become difficult. He had seen enough in the service to know that people revealed themselves most clearly when there was not enough to go around. If hardship could make him stop caring about everyone except himself, then it would have taken something more valuable than his apartment. Still, kindness did not solve his problem. Winter was approaching, temporary jobs were becoming less reliable, and Buddy was no longer a young dog who could comfortably spend months sleeping inside a cold truck. Jack began searching county listings, cheap campgrounds, condemned trailers, anything that might offer even a small piece of permanence. He found Blackwater Quarry almost by accident on a bulletin board outside the county administration building. The printed auction notice was curling at the corners beneath a plastic cover. Nearly 30 acres, abandoned quarry property, flooded extraction pit, structures sold as is. The site had apparently been unused for more than 35 years. Jack read the page twice. He could not afford a house, a proper mobile home, or even a decent long-term rental deposit, but the opening price for Blackwater was strangely low. Low enough that, for the first time in weeks, he did not immediately walk away. Why would almost 30 acres have attracted so little interest? What had happened there that made an entire property sit unwanted for more than 3 decades? And what exactly remained beneath the dark water described in the county paperwork? Jack felt Buddy press against his leg and looked down. "Don't start," he murmured. I know a terrible idea when I see one. Buddy wagged his tail once. If you're enjoying Jack and Buddy's journey, tell us what you think in the comments, and subscribe so you can continue the story with them. Jack folded the auction notice, slipped it into his jacket, and walked back toward the pickup, unaware that the cheapest piece of land in the county was about to become the most important decision of his life. 2 mornings after Jack found the auction notice, he stood inside the Pine Ridge County meeting room with Buddy waiting in the pickup outside beneath a pale winter sky. The room smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee, and nearly every person there seemed to know someone else. Jack did not. He took a seat near the back and studied the thin packet he had requested about Blackwater Quarry. The property covered almost 30 acres on the edge of the county, but most of its value had vanished decades earlier. In 1991, a massive landslide had torn through the lowest extraction level, damaging access roads and destroying the pumps that kept groundwater out. Water slowly swallowed the bottom of the quarry, and the company operating it shut down soon afterward. Since then, weeds had taken the service roads, buildings had deteriorated, and the flooded pit had become the feature everyone remembered. Jack stared at the photographs attached to the county file. Dark water surrounded by layered stone walls, rusting equipment half hidden in brush, and an abandoned office building leaning slightly toward the hillside. It looked less like property than something the county had forgotten to erase. The auction was conducted by Ellen Parker, a county clerk in her early 50s, with short auburn hair, fair skin, narrow reading glasses, and the efficient manner of someone who had spent decades dealing with people who wanted exceptions to rules she had no authority to change. She was polite but direct, reading each property description without drama. Houses went first, then vacant lots and several neglected commercial parcels. When Blackwater Quarry was announced, a few men in the room exchanged amused looks. Ellen mentioned the acreage, the flooded excavation, the abandoned structures, and the fact that the property was being sold as is. Then she called for the opening bid. Silence followed. Jack waited several seconds, wondering whether that silence was warning enough. He thought of his pickup, the freezing nights, Buddy curled beside him, and the amount remaining in his bank account. $3,400 was almost everything he had left. Spending it on a flooded quarry sounded ridiculous even inside his own head. But the alternative was watching that money disappear gradually into motel rooms, fuel, food, and another month of survival without a destination. Jack raised his hand. Someone near the front laughed quietly. Another man turned around and looked at Jack as though trying to decide whether he was serious. No second bid came. Ellen repeated the amount, waited, and finally brought the sale to a close. Just like that, Jack Miller owned Blackwater Quarry for $3,400. Outside, Buddy stood with his front paws against the passenger window as Jack approached. Jack opened the door and looked at him. "Well," he said, holding up the paperwork, "we may officially be the poorest landowners in Kentucky." Buddy sneezed and climbed across the seat. Jack chose to interpret that as confidence. By afternoon, however, the humor had faded. After fees, fuel, and basic supplies, almost nothing remained. He had exchanged the last meaningful cushion between himself and disaster for land everyone else had refused to touch. Blackwater was worse in person than the county photographs suggested. The gravel entrance had nearly disappeared beneath weeds. An old chain-link gate leaned from one hinge, and beyond it a cracked service road curved through dense brush toward the flooded quarry. The water itself was enormous and unnaturally still, filling the abandoned excavation like a dark sheet of glass. Across the far side, exposed stone terraces climbed upward in gray steps. Jack found the remains of a maintenance shed, a collapsed equipment shelter, and the shell of the old quarry office, none of which was safe enough to sleep inside. For the first several nights, he and Buddy remained in the pickup while Jack searched for something better. A man from one of his temporary loading jobs finally told him about an aging travel trailer sitting behind a relative's barn. The trailer had water stains along the ceiling, a damaged window latch, and a furnace that worked only when it felt charitable, but the owner accepted a small amount of cash and 2 days of Jack's labor in exchange for it. Jack positioned the trailer on high ground, well away from the quarry edge. He patched the roof with sealant, replaced rotten boards near the door, and connected a small used generator he bought from a mechanic in town. Nothing matched. Nothing looked finished. Yet on the first evening he sat inside with Buddy stretched across the worn linoleum floor. Jack felt something he had not experienced in months. No parking lot security guard would knock on the glass. No landlord would ask when the rent was coming. No engine needed to run just to keep them warm while they slept. The trailer leaked when heavy rain arrived. The generator coughed unpredictably, and Jack still had to haul drinking water in plastic containers. But the place was theirs. Buddy seemed to understand before Jack did. The dog wandered through the tiny trailer, inspected every corner, then settled beside the door with a long sigh, as though he had personally approved the purchase. Owning land did not solve the problem of earning money. Jack continued taking whatever work he could find, unloading trucks at a feed warehouse, clearing brush from a roadside property, helping repair fencing, and carrying stone for a landscaping crew. Some days he returned after dark with aching shoulders and barely enough cash to cover food and gasoline. Word about the former Navy SEAL who had spent his last savings on Blackwater traveled quickly. At a gas station, Jack overheard 2 men joking that he had paid thousands of dollars for the county's biggest swimming hole. Another asked whether he planned to start charging admission to the mosquitoes. Jack ignored them. He had endured worse things than laughter. What bothered him more was the possibility that they were right. On especially cold nights, when wind pushed against the trailer walls and the generator sputtered, he wondered whether he had confused desperation with courage. Still, every morning Jack opened the trailer door and saw Buddy waiting eagerly outside, tail moving as he surveyed the property. The German Shepherd developed a routine of walking the perimeter with Jack before breakfast, exploring the old roads and returning muddy but satisfied. Jack began clearing brush near the trailer and marking sections of the property that might someday be useful. Blackwater was broken, neglected, and almost certainly worth far less than the dreams Jack occasionally allowed himself to imagine. But it was also the first thing he had owned in years that could not disappear with a missed paycheck. Standing beside the dark quarry one evening, Jack looked across 30 acres no one else had wanted, and realized that for now, that was enough. He did not know whether Blackwater would ever give him anything more than a place to stay. He only knew that he and Buddy finally had ground beneath their feet that belonged to them. By late July, the hills around Blackwater had turned the dull brown-green of a summer that had gone too long without rain. For nearly 6 weeks, storms had passed north or broken apart before reaching the quarry, and every morning Jack could see the waterline sitting a little lower against the layered rock. At first, the change meant nothing to him beyond another problem. The plastic tanks beside the trailer were running low, temporary landscaping jobs had become scarce, and even the small creeks feeding nearby farms had weakened to muddy ribbons. Jack spent his days taking whatever work remained, and his evenings patching the trailer or clearing brush from the old service roads. Buddy, however, seemed fascinated by the changing shoreline. New stretches of pale stone and black mud appeared almost every week, exposing rusted cable, broken pipe, and pieces of machinery that had been underwater longer than Jack had been an adult. The German Shepherd made his usual morning rounds more slowly now in the heat, his gray muzzle lowered as he investigated each newly exposed patch. Jack rarely stopped him. Buddy had turned exploring Blackwater into a job, and appeared to take the responsibility more seriously than some supervisors Jack had known. One morning, Buddy suddenly left the trail and scrambled down a shallow slope toward the northern edge of the quarry. Jack called him back, but the dog stopped near a strip of wet mud and began barking. It was not the excited bark he used when chasing a rabbit. It was short, deliberate, almost irritated. Jack climbed down carefully, boots sinking several inches into the softened ground. At first he saw nothing except pieces of stone and a length of corroded metal. Then sunlight caught a smooth, curved surface beneath the mud. Jack crouched and brushed away loose dirt with a broken piece of wood. The object was painted beneath the rust, and its shape was too uniform to belong to ordinary quarry equipment. Buddy pressed forward to sniff at a strip of old rubber that had emerged nearby, then looked back at Jack, as if expecting him to finally understand. Jack did not. Over the next 4 days, the water continued to fall. More metal appeared, followed by what looked unmistakably like the upper edge of a vehicle roof. Jack stopped guessing and decided to find someone who knew Blackwater before it became a lake. That person was Tom Harris, a 71-year-old former quarry worker who lived 6 miles outside town in a small brick house crowded by maple trees. Tom was a broad-shouldered man whose age had bent him slightly without making him seem fragile. His face was deeply lined from decades of outdoor work, with a square jaw, pale blue eyes, and a thick gray mustache that almost hid his upper lip. What remained of his hair was silver and cut short. 2 fingers on his left hand did not straighten completely, an old crushing injury from a conveyor accident when he was 28. The accident had made Tom cautious rather than fearful. He had spent the rest of his working life insisting that younger men check equipment twice, earning a reputation for being stubborn about safety and unexpectedly patient with people. When Jack mentioned the northern wall and showed him photographs of the exposed metal, Tom's expression changed. He stared at one image longer than the others. "That's below the old haul road," he said. Jack asked what kind of vehicle might have been left there. Tom shook his head. "Nothing we used should be shaped like that." Tom arrived at Blackwater the following morning with an old diving suit, a modern replacement air tank borrowed from a friend, ropes, and enough caution to make Jack trust him. The exposed section was now close enough to shore that Tom did not need to descend far. Jack anchored the safety rope above the slope while Buddy paced behind him, watching the water. Tom disappeared beneath the brown-green surface for several minutes, surfaced once to reposition himself, then went down again. When he finally climbed onto the rocks, water poured from his suit and his breathing was heavy, but that was not what Jack noticed. Tom looked disturbed. He pulled off his mask and stared back toward the quarry. "It's a truck," he said. Jack asked if it belonged to the old operation. Tom wiped water from his mustache. "No. Armored transport. Heavy body, reinforced rear doors. And it's sitting right where the lower haul road used to run." Tom explained that before the 1991 collapse, a service road descended along the northern wall to the deepest working level. When the rock face failed and pumping equipment was lost, water eventually buried the entire route. Anything left down there would have vanished with it. They waited another week as the drought exposed enough of the vehicle to work safely from the shallows. Jack rented a portable winch with money he could barely afford to spend, while Tom brought heavy chains and tools collected over a lifetime in mining. The job took most of a day. Mud had packed tightly around the rear of the truck, and the doors resisted every attempt to move them. Buddy remained on higher ground, occasionally wandering down to inspect their progress before retreating from the noise of grinding metal. Near sunset, one rear door finally shifted several inches. Stale brown water poured through the opening. Jack widened the gap, expecting perhaps empty cargo space, old machinery, or whatever remained after 35 years underwater. Instead, the beam of his flashlight landed on rows of rectangular steel containers stacked tightly inside. Tom climbed closer. There were dozens of them, each built with thick edges and sealed lids. No money was visible. No bags of valuables, just boxes. Jack and Tom removed the first 2 containers and carried them onto dry ground. Despite corrosion on the outside, the seals had held. Jack forced one latch free and slowly lifted the lid. Inside were bundles of paper protected within heavy plastic sleeves. Property records, survey sheets, accounting books, maps, typed reports. Some bore dates from the months before Blackwater closed. Jack opened the second container and found more of the same. He looked toward the truck, where dozens of unopened boxes still waited in the fading light. Then at Tom, whose usual calm had disappeared. Neither man yet knew why anyone had placed so many original records inside an armored vehicle, or why that vehicle had ended up on the deepest road of a quarry shortly before it flooded. Jack only knew one thing with certainty. Buddy had led him to something that was never supposed to return to the surface. Jack moved the recovered boxes into the driest part of the trailer and spent the next several evenings sorting them with Tom. Buddy usually lay near the door, lifting his head whenever Jack shifted another stack of papers onto the table. Years of water had stained the outside of the steel containers, but the sealed plastic sleeves inside had protected most of the records surprisingly well. The documents were not random business files. They were organized by property number, employee account, survey district, and date. Jack quickly noticed 2 versions of several land deeds. One listed families who had owned farms and wooded acreage around Blackwater for generations. Another, filed only months later, transferred the same property to companies with unfamiliar names. Signatures appeared slightly different. Boundary lines changed. Tom recognized several family names immediately. Some belonged to men he had worked beside underground. Others belonged to elderly couples who had suddenly left the county in the years before the quarry closed. "We were told they sold out," Tom said quietly. "Some of them swore they never did." One name appeared throughout the boxes: Samuel Reed. A faded employee photograph clipped to an accounting report showed a man in his early 40s with a narrow build, neatly combed dark hair, deep-set brown eyes, and a clean-shaven face that looked more thoughtful than severe. Tom remembered him. Samuel had been Blackwater's senior accountant, a quiet man who wore pressed shirts even when everyone around him was covered in quarry dust. He rarely raised his voice and had a reputation for checking every figure twice. According to Tom, that caution came from growing up in a family that had nearly lost its small home after a bank error placed another man's debt against his father's name. Samuel had spent years believing that paperwork was never just paperwork, because a wrong number could destroy a real family. The records showed that sometime in 1990, he began comparing company purchases with county property transfers. What he found was a pattern. Parcels around Blackwater had been moved through several shell companies using altered deeds, manipulated surveys, and signatures that did not match older originals. Once ownership changed on paper, mineral rights were transferred separately, leaving families with little ability to challenge what had happened. The financial ledgers revealed another problem. Money deducted from workers' paychecks for retirement had not always gone where employees believed. Large amounts were redirected through consulting accounts and holding companies connected to Blackwater's senior management. Tom sat silently when Jack showed him one ledger containing names of workers whose retirement balances had been reduced. Tom found his own name halfway down the page. For years he had assumed the company collapse simply wiped out part of his pension. Now the numbers suggested something very different. Yet the most disturbing papers concerned the quarry itself. Engineering reports from early 1991 repeatedly warned that cracks were spreading through the northern rock face, above the lowest extraction level. One report recommended suspending operations until the slope could be reinforced. A handwritten management note rejected the shutdown because production targets were already behind schedule. Another memo instructed supervisors to keep crews working while further inspections were under review. Jack read the sentence twice. His military background had taught him that risk could never be eliminated, but deliberately sending people into a known danger was something else entirely. Samuel appeared to have understood the scale of what he had uncovered. Near the bottom of one box, Jack found copies of letters addressed to the Kentucky State Prosecutor's Office. Samuel described suspicious property transfers, missing retirement money, and concealed safety reports. He requested a confidential meeting and wrote that he possessed original documents capable of proving the allegations. A shipping manifest dated only days before the 1991 landslide provided the next piece. It listed dozens of sealed record containers transferred from Blackwater's administrative building into an armored transport truck contracted to carry sensitive financial materials. Samuel's name appeared as the authorized custodian. The intended destination was a government office outside the county, but the manifest was stamped "Canceled" in red ink. Attached to it was a handwritten note stating that the vehicle had been ordered back onto company property before reaching the main road. No explanation was given. Tom studied the date and slowly shook his head. He remembered that day. Workers had seen an unfamiliar truck near the administration building, but management told everyone it was handling payroll records. A maintenance map helped Jack reconstruct what happened next. The armored truck had apparently been driven down the Northern Hall Road toward the quarry's lowest level, the same route where Jack and Tom had found it. Whether Samuel was still with the vehicle was not recorded, and neither man had enough evidence to guess. What was clear was that the records never reached the prosecutor. Within days, the northern wall failed. Tons of rock crashed across the lower road, damaging pumping equipment and cutting off access to the deepest section. Groundwater began rising afterward, slowly covering machinery, roadways, and eventually the armored truck itself. Blackwater shut down soon after. The official history called the disaster an unpredictable geological failure followed by financial collapse. The papers sitting on Jack's table told a different story. Management had been warned about the unstable wall. Samuel had attempted to remove evidence of land and pension fraud, and the vehicle carrying those records had been stopped before it could leave. Near midnight, Jack closed the final folder and looked through the trailer window toward the quarry. Buddy had moved beside his chair, resting his gray muzzle against Jack's boot. For 35 years, the water outside had hidden more than an abandoned truck. It had hidden stolen land, missing retirement money, ignored safety warnings, and the unfinished work of a quiet accountant who had tried to make someone listen. Jack still did not know who ordered the truck back, why it was taken to the lowest level, or what became of Samuel Reed after that day. But one fact no longer seemed open to doubt. The armored truck had not been placed beneath Blackwater to protect something valuable. It had disappeared there because someone had been desperate to keep the truth from leaving. By the end of the week, Jack realized Blackwater was no longer quiet. Someone at the equipment rental yard had mentioned the armored truck. Then someone else repeated the story at a diner, and within days half the county seemed to know that the former Navy SEAL, living beside the flooded quarry, had pulled sealed boxes from a vehicle buried there since 1991. Jack hated how quickly curiosity traveled through a small town. He and Tom stopped discussing the documents anywhere except inside the trailer, and Jack began photographing every page with his phone before copying the files onto several flash drives. One remained hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Another went into a waterproof container concealed away from the trailer. Tom took a third copy home. Jack had learned long ago that anything important enough to protect should never exist in only one place. Buddy seemed to understand that something had changed as well. At night, the German shepherd no longer slept deeply beside the door. His ears remained alert, and several times Jack woke to find him standing silently at the window, staring toward the trees. 3 nights later, Buddy's warning became impossible to dismiss. Jack had just finished washing dishes when the dog rose abruptly, body stiff, gray muzzle pointed toward the dark service road. A low growl formed in his chest. Jack reached for a flashlight and started toward the door, but Buddy stepped directly in front of him. It was unusual enough that Jack stopped. The dog did not bark or look back. He simply stood there, muscles tight, refusing to move. Jack switched off the trailer lights instead. Through a narrow gap in the curtain, he watched 2 figures emerge between the trees. Both wore dark jackets and moved carefully toward the small storage shed, where Jack had placed several empty steel boxes as decoys. One tried the lock, while the other watched the trailer. After less than a minute, they retreated and disappeared down the road. Jack waited another 20 minutes before stepping outside. The shed lock had been damaged, and fresh tire tracks marked the dirt near the entrance. Nothing valuable had been taken, but the message was clear. Someone knew enough about the discovery to come looking. The next morning, Jack moved the remaining original documents again. He did not tell neighbors what had happened, and did not contact anyone connected to the old quarry. What disturbed him most was not the attempted break-in itself, but the precision behind it. The strangers had not searched the pickup or stolen tools. They had gone directly toward the place where records might have been stored. Buddy stayed unusually close while Jack worked, following him from the trailer to the shed and back again. Jack rubbed the dog's neck and muttered, "You keep doing that, I'm going to have to put you on payroll." Buddy gave him the same serious expression he always wore when Jack made jokes no one else would have laughed at. By afternoon, Jack had begun wondering how far the story had traveled, and who might have the most to lose if the Blackwater records became public. The answer arrived 2 days later in the form of a black SUV. It stopped beside the trailer shortly before noon, polished enough to look almost absurd against the mud and rust around Blackwater. The man who stepped out introduced himself as Richard Cole, 52, CEO of Cole Mineral Group. Richard was tall and trim, with carefully combed dark hair beginning to silver above the ears, light skin, a clean-shaven angular face, and calm gray eyes that rarely seemed to reveal surprise. His dark tailored coat and expensive leather shoes looked untouched by the road. He spoke politely and never raised his voice, but there was something practiced in the way he chose every word. Richard had grown up inside the mining industry. His father, Charles Cole, had served as a senior executive for the company that controlled Blackwater in 1991. After Charles died, Richard expanded the family's remaining assets into Cole Mineral Group and built a reputation for being courteous in public, relentless in negotiation, and almost impossible to read. He spoke to Jack as though they were 2 businessmen discussing an ordinary property transaction. Cole Mineral Group, Richard explained, had recently reviewed land in the area and was interested in acquiring Blackwater Quarry for future industrial use. He offered $500,000 for the entire property, including all abandoned structures, equipment, and anything recovered from the site. Jack almost laughed at the number. He had paid $400. $500,000 would buy a real house, replace his dying pickup, erase every unpaid bill, and leave enough money that he would not have to wonder whether the next temporary job would last. He imagined Buddy sleeping somewhere warm through winter. He imagined waking without calculating the cost of gasoline before deciding whether to drive into town. For a few seconds, the offer felt less like money and more like permission to stop struggling. Then Jack looked past Richard toward the dark water. Cole Mineral Group had ignored Blackwater for decades. Now, Only days after an armored truck and sealed records surfaced, its CEO was standing beside Jack's leaking trailer offering nearly 150 times what Jack had paid. Richard never mentioned the documents directly. He did not need to. The phrase, "anything recovered from the site," had already said enough. Jack asked why the property had suddenly become worth $500,000. Richard smiled slightly and said opportunities changed with time. Jack had spent enough years listening to people avoid direct answers to recognize one immediately. Buddy stepped closer to Jack's leg and watched Richard without wagging his tail. Jack folded the written offer once and handed it back. "Not for sale." For the first time, Richard's expression changed, though only slightly. He reminded Jack that offers like this did not remain available forever, then returned calmly to the SUV and drove away. Jack watched the vehicle disappear beyond the gate before looking down at Buddy. The money could have changed their lives. Refusing it might make those lives considerably harder. But Jack now understood something more important than the number on the page. Someone had tried to enter Blackwater at night, and a powerful mining executive suddenly wanted to own everything on the property. Whatever Samuel Reed had tried to expose in 1991, the people connected to it were still afraid of what had risen from the water. Jack knew refusing Richard Cole was only useful if the documents could survive whatever came next. Tom introduced him to Sarah Collins, a 48-year-old property attorney from Lexington who had spent nearly 20 years handling disputed deeds and mineral rights across eastern Kentucky. Sarah was tall and slender, with fair skin, straight chestnut brown hair cut just below her shoulders, sharp green eyes, and a composed expression that made people think carefully before exaggerating around her. She dressed simply, spoke without wasting words, and had developed a deep distrust of convenient paperwork after representing an elderly couple who lost family land because no one questioned a forged transfer until years too late. Sarah examined only a dozen Blackwater documents before asking Jack to show her everything. She did not call them proof immediately. Instead, she said the records had to be authenticated one by one. Through Sarah came Michael Reed, 63, a retired federal financial investigator with no relation to Samuel Reed. Michael was a lean, broad-chested man with close-cropped silver hair, a trimmed gray beard, deep lines around dark eyes, and the habit of listening without interrupting. 30 years investigating fraud had made him patient and suspicious of dramatic conclusions. He believed numbers were useful precisely because they did not care who was powerful. For the next several months, Jack's trailer became an unofficial records room. Sarah compared the recovered deeds against county archives, while Michael traced bank accounts, holding companies, pension transfers, and mineral leases. Tom identified names, old supervisors, access roads, and the locations shown on faded quarry maps. Jack handled scanning, organizing, and maintaining duplicate copies in separate locations. Buddy remained close to him through the long nights, usually sleeping beneath the table until someone moved toward the door. Slowly, the pattern became impossible to dismiss. Families who appeared to have sold land voluntarily had signatures that differed from older legal records. Survey boundaries had been redrawn to move mineral-rich acreage into shell companies. Pension deductions taken from workers had been diverted through consulting firms connected to Blackwater executives. Even more troubling, several properties now controlled by Coal Mineral Group could be traced back through those same questionable transfers. Richard's $500,000 offer suddenly made perfect sense. Blackwater Quarry itself was not what he had been trying to buy. He had been trying to gain control of the evidence that could threaten everything built on those old transactions. Sarah and Michael refused to rush the case. They interviewed surviving property owners and former workers, sometimes finding people who had carried unanswered questions for 35 years. One elderly family still possessed tax receipts, showing ownership years after company records claimed their land had been sold. Another former worker produced pension statements that did not match the balances listed in Blackwater's internal books. When enough independent records supported the documents from the armored truck, Sarah submitted the evidence through formal legal channels, while Michael contacted former colleagues who could place it before the appropriate investigators. The result was no longer something Richard Cole could settle privately with Jack. State and federal authorities opened investigations into historical land fraud, pension theft, and the financial benefits that had continued through successor companies. Search orders followed. Corporate records were seized. Old property files that had sat unquestioned for decades were reopened beside the originals recovered from Blackwater. The safety documents changed the town's understanding of 1991 as well. Engineers had repeatedly warned management about instability along the northern wall, yet production continued. Investigators confirmed that key warnings had been omitted from later public accounts of the disaster. The landslide could no longer be described simply as a catastrophe no one had seen coming. At the same time, Samuel Reed's letters and shipping records established that he had attempted to deliver evidence to state authorities before the quarry closed. His name, barely remembered outside a few old employees, appeared again in newspapers and official reports. Samuel had not been a disgruntled accountant who disappeared during a company collapse, as some old rumors suggested. He had been trying to expose fraud and dangerous decisions before the evidence vanished with the armored truck. Tom read the findings quietly, then folded the newspaper and said, "Took 35 years for somebody to finally believe him." The legal consequences unfolded gradually rather than all at once. Courts reviewed disputed deeds using the newly authenticated records. Some families regained property that had been transferred through forged documents. Others received settlements where ownership could no longer practically be restored. Former workers and surviving spouses recovered pension benefits that had been improperly diverted. Claims tied to mineral rights were reopened, forcing Coal Mineral Group to surrender or compensate for interests derived from fraudulent transfers. Jack attended several hearings, but rarely spoke unless asked. He watched elderly men clutch corrected property papers with shaking hands, and families see grandparents' names restored to land records. That mattered more to him than seeing executives surrounded by cameras. Jack had spent much of his adult life believing service meant standing between danger and someone who could not defend themselves. He had never expected that principle to follow him into a flooded quarry. When reporters eventually gathered outside Blackwater and asked Jack how a former Navy SEAL had uncovered a conspiracy hidden for more than 3 decades, he shook his head and glanced toward Buddy. The old German shepherd stood beside the trailer, gray muzzle lifted toward the crowd, looking mildly offended by the attention. "You've got the wrong hero," Jack said. "I didn't find that truck. Buddy did. I was just smart enough to follow him." People laughed, but Jack did not. He meant every word. The documents had restored land, retirement money, and Samuel Reed's honor, but none of it would have happened if one aging dog had not refused to ignore something strange along a muddy shoreline. For the first time since Jack bought Blackwater, the truth no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to everyone who had waited 35 years to hear it. The legal fight ended more quietly than Jack expected. There was no single dramatic morning when every problem disappeared. Instead, months of hearings, corrected property records, settlements, and signed agreements slowly brought Blackwater into a new chapter. The courts confirmed that Jack had purchased the quarry legally, and that no successor company could challenge his ownership simply because evidence had later been recovered there. He also received a substantial financial settlement connected to the unlawful entry onto his property, damaged equipment, and attempts to interfere with the records investigation. It was not the kind of fortune newspapers liked to invent, but it was enough to change the practical shape of his life. Jack could finally replace the pickup that had carried him through homelessness, clear the debts that had followed him for years, and stop checking his bank balance before every grocery trip. The first thing he bought was not a new truck or expensive clothes. He replaced Buddy's worn veterinary bed and scheduled a full health examination for the aging German shepherd. When the veterinarian said Buddy was healthy for his age but needed more rest for his joints, Jack smiled. "Good," he said. "For once we've got time." Offers for Blackwater began arriving soon afterward. Developers saw nearly 30 acres, a large body of water, growing public attention, and an opportunity to build expensive homes or a private recreation property. Some offers were far higher than the $500,000 Richard Cole had once placed in front of Jack. Jack read each one, then filed it away without answering. Selling would have been the easiest decision financially, but Blackwater no longer felt like an investment. He remembered the names in Samuel Reed's files, the workers whose pension money had vanished, and the families who had spent decades believing no one would ever admit what had happened to them. He also remembered arriving there with almost nothing except a damaged pickup, a leaking trailer, and Buddy beside him. Turning that place into another fenced development felt wrong. Jack began meeting with former quarry workers, local families, Sarah, Tom, and county representatives about preserving part of the site. The idea that emerged was simple. The place that had hidden the truth would become the place that remembered it. Construction on Blackwater Workers Memorial Park began the following spring. The dangerous sections near the old quarry walls were fenced and secured, while a safe path was built along the higher ground overlooking the water. Stone markers carried the names of workers affected by the 1991 collapse and families whose property rights had been damaged by the fraud. A small interpretive building displayed copies of selected historical records, photographs, and the story of Samuel Reed's attempt to bring the evidence out. Jack insisted that the park not make him the center of anything. When one planning committee suggested placing his name on the entrance plaque, he refused immediately. "Put Samuel's name there," he said. "He started this 35 years before I showed up." Tom supported him without hesitation. On opening day, former workers stood beside children and grandchildren who had grown up hearing only fragments of the story. Buddy remained near Jack's leg through most of the ceremony, accepting attention with the patient dignity of a dog who seemed to believe the crowd had gathered primarily because he had done his job correctly. Jack used another section of the property for something more personal. During his years after leaving the Navy, he had met too many veterans who returned home prepared for danger, but unprepared for rent, hiring interviews, broken vehicles, medical bills, and the slow humiliation of needing help. He created a small non-profit program based at Blackwater that connected struggling veterans with local employers, short-term housing, work clothes, transportation assistance, and practical job training. The program was modest at first. 2 renovated buildings, a small workshop, several temporary rooms, and partnerships with local construction crews, warehouses, and transportation companies. Jack deliberately focused on men and women from working-class backgrounds who did not need speeches about heroism as much as they needed steady hours and someone willing to give them another chance. He understood that difference because he had lived it. When a veteran arrived embarrassed about needing help, Jack never asked what mistake had brought them there. He asked what kind of work they knew, what they wanted to learn, and what problem needed solving first. His own home was built on a quiet rise above the quarry. It was small, with a wide porch, plain wooden siding, and enough windows to let morning light reach the kitchen. Jack could easily have afforded something larger, but size had stopped meaning security to him years earlier. The house contained what he actually wanted: a solid roof, a warm bedroom, a kitchen that did not shake when the wind blew, and a place beside the front window where Buddy could sleep in the sun, The German Shepherd's muzzle became almost completely gray over the following years. His steps slowed, and Jack shortened their walks, but Buddy still insisted on making a morning circuit around the property whenever the weather allowed. Sometimes he stopped at the section of shoreline where the metal roof had first emerged from the mud. Jack would wait beside him without rushing. Neither needed to move quickly anymore. One evening, Jack sat on the porch while the quarry reflected the last light of the day. In the distance, he could see visitors leaving the memorial trail and lights coming on inside the veteran's workshop. Buddy lowered himself beside Jack's chair and rested his head across one boot, just as he had done during cold nights in the old pickup. Jack thought about how strange the road had been. He had returned from war believing the hardest part of his life was behind him, only to discover that rebuilding could demand a different kind of endurance. Blackwater had not rescued him by making him rich. It had given him something harder to measure: responsibility, connection, and a reason to believe that the years ahead still mattered. Jack reached down and rested one hand on Buddy's graying neck. The quarry everyone else had called worthless had become a memorial, a second chance for strangers, and finally a home for the two of them. And for the first time in many years, Jack no longer felt like a man trying to find where he belonged. He was already there. Sometimes life strips away the things we thought defined us: a job, a home, security, even the future we had carefully imagined. But what remains can matter far more: integrity, courage, compassion, and the willingness to begin again. Jack's journey reminds us that what the world dismisses as worthless may still hold truth, purpose, and the doorway to a second chance. It also reminds us that justice is not only about exposing wrongdoing, but about restoring dignity to those who were forgotten. Truth can be buried for years, but it has a way of finding the light. And ordinary people can still make extraordinary choices when they refuse to look away. If this story gave you hope, share it with someone who may need that reminder today. Thank you for staying with us to the end. Never underestimate what courage and loyalty can rebuild.